I don't really know what I'm going to say by way of introducing this, but I'm going to make a couple of very general comments to put myself in context, I suppose, in a way. I believe that in the post-World War II world, that there were a number of things that happened which were the direct result of the appalling events which had preceded that time in the late 40s. And they were attempts which have defined in many ways, I would like to think, my own life. And they were based upon a belief in the integration of people and regions. Therefore, I believe, for an example, that the European integration process, which is challenged by the migration issue, as we all know, and which was created by a small group of men after the Second World War, was based upon a concept which a British politician described as the taming of nationalism. And I believe in the taming of nationalism. I've seen too much of it in my own country, and I've seen it elsewhere. And at the same time, a number of other steps were taken, one of which was the Refugee Convention in 1951, which was a direct result of the enormity of the horrible events of World War II. And everybody knows the famous story of the St. Louis, the ship that left Hamburg carrying Jewish refugees, which was turned away in many places and ended up bringing, unfortunately, some back who perished. And refugees became then a moral cause. They should have been a moral cause earlier, but they weren't. And refugees is a key element, but not the only element, in the mobility of people, which is challenged and which is now the subject matter of so much political debate and concern. I'm going to focus more on Europe than anywhere else, but the same arguments could be advanced in respect of the Andaman Sea. They could be advanced in respect of, for an example, Myanmar and those who have fled from Myanmar, and in many other places. The Pacific Ocean and the Americas have their own challenges, including the United States of America, which incidentally, looking at the number of refugees per capita taken in the United States, the figures are pathetic. So the United States doesn't have a particularly high place at the moment in the number of countries which have taken large numbers of refugees in this situation. As we know, there are over 500,000 dead in Syria. There are currently 60 million people in the world displaced. There are 20 million refugees, and of the refugees, 60% of them are in 10 countries. Proximity seems to define responsibility. If you're unlucky enough to live in the Lebanon, or in Jordan, or in Turkey, you take far more refugees than anybody else per capita. In the European Union, the Greeks take by far the most. And as we collectively and rapidly develop razor wire fences right up through the Balkans, and as our borders, following the collapse in 1989 of the Iron Curtain, are re-erected, not merely in Central and Eastern Europe, but right across Europe with the possible collapse of Schengen, one of the great achievements of the European Union, we create a situation where rapidly Greece will become a vast internment camp for refugees. Lesbos at the moment is taking in 4,000 a day. And these people are traveling across the Mediterranean in rickety boats at enormous cost and threat to their own lives. And we've seen the thousands who have drowned. We have seen the awful pictures of children lying on beaches. And the Greeks are left with the situation, and Europe is left with the situation, and the world is left with the situation, that as these thousands arrive from Turkey, generally, because that's the route that they take from Syria, we say, we've had enough. All over Europe, people are saying, we've had enough. Xenophobia is on the rise. People like Trump are making similar arguments about migrants more generally in the United States. This is our land, is the refrain. And in the Greek situation, just to take it as an example, what are the alternatives open in regard to the refugees? Send them back out to sea so they drown, leave them on the beaches or in the freezing rivers of the Balkans, intern them in a huge camp, which is gradually, and not too gradually at that, taking place, or do we welcome them? We have 540 million people in the richest part of the world. We're talking about 1 million people a year. You can work out the percentages yourselves that this would require. Of course, they all want to go to some countries rather than others. They'd all like to go to Germany because Germany's GDP and its unemployment rate, and indeed its demographic profile, shows that there is an open opportunity. Many of them want to go to England and Britain, not merely because Britain has had a fairly buoyant economy, but I think, having visited Calais, which was one of the more notorious camps, and spoken to many of them, largely because, in the case of England, they speak English. As Mrs. Merkel has said, this is beginning to pose an existential issue for the European Union, which I believe to be the most noble political movement in the history of Europe for 1,000 years. Because it is about taming nationalism, and because it's about sharing sovereignty. Of course, at the same time, we have the aggravating factors, such as Brexit, the debate of Britain leaving the European Union. We have the borders that are being recreated around Europe. We have the austerity which some blame on Europe in terms of economic policy and so on, but I won't go into all of that. I dug out a few figures last night. Between January and November 2015, Sweden took, and I'm just talking about refugees, 14,328. Ireland took 637. UK took 531. And the US took 379. This is a pretty horrific indictment and an expression of the differences between different countries and their response to this. To my mind, Mrs. Merkel has been a hero. I was standing beside her in Malta when we had a conference with Africa not too long ago, and I whispered in her ear, "You're a hero." And she said, "Why?" And I said, "You're a hero because you have expressed a moral vision at your own political cost." And she said, I can't remember, I should have written down the words, but she in effect said, "What can Europe do in this situation but open?" And she's right, and she is suffering. 2016, we've already had 70,000 coming across the Mediterranean. It's not going to go away. It's going to get worse. And anybody who lives in the illusion that we're suddenly, well, I don't know. I'm no expert on the peace negotiations that are taking place. But if history is anything to go by, we can't take for granted that this problem in any way is going to significantly abate in the immediate future. So we have a huge moral issue, and we have a defining issue for our generation, in my view. And as proximity should not define responsibility, it's a global responsibility. Why should the US be less responsible for the migrants and refugees than Greece? Why should Lebanon have a quarter of its population refugees? Or why should Jordan have 635,000? Or why should Turkey have 2.6 million, as we sit and pontificate in other parts of the world? At the same time, we have the dilemma and the promise of our democratic ideals. And our peoples are saying no more. How does one equate this democratic belief and the obligation of politicians, obviously, to respond to democracy with the moral responsibility that rests upon us in regard to refugees? Well, to my mind, and it may be a simplistic answer, one answer to that is that if you have politicians who won't lead, then you can expect xenophobia. If you have politicians who will not confront racism and xenophobia, then you'll get more of it. If you've nobody who's prepared to stand up and say that the objective evidence is that migrants add to growth, which it is, there, clear and unambiguous, that they accept and take less by way of benefits than they contribute by way of tax, that they have lower unemployment rates all over the world. If you're not prepared to say that, then you reap what you sow. Of course, xenophobia will develop. Of course, the inherent racism that we all suffer from, including the new countries, which are themselves created out of an immigrant community. George Orwell, I think, made the comment once about racism and about nationalism, that nationalism, in the end of the day, is thinking you're better than somebody else. And in a strange sort of way, scratch the surface and we all think it, to a greater or lesser extent. Logically, we may reject it. Morally, we may reject it. But when Ireland hopefully trumps England tomorrow in Twickenham, I can tell you I will not be cheering for England. So there's no easy way out of this, but rational argument, rational debate, and the expression of opinion by those who, in the European context, I know it's a different word here, aspire to a liberal society. And that's what I aspire to. That's what I believe the Charter of the United Nations aspires to. That's what the treaties of the European Union aspire to. So either we're going to duck down and accept the outrageous statements made by some prime ministers in Europe, for an example, yes, we'll take refugees as long as they're Christians. What in God's name, what century are we living in? What do we say to those who say now that they are going to confront the European Court of Justice by having a referendum to reject a European law? Hallstein, the first great president of the European Commission, said that Europe is founded on law and respect for the law and the rights of man. If the respect for the law goes, unlike the time of Hitler or Napoleon, we don't rely upon divisions. We rely on principles and we rely on law. So, to my mind, the challenge that we face is the supreme challenge of our time, we Europeans particularly, and we're not rising to it. All over Europe, politicians are ducking under the eiderdown. They're kowtowing to a type of articulation that is a rejection of the very principles that the post-World War II era that I started with should have created. And I think we have to do something about it. And that's why I'm here.